The Dark Moon Greatsword has gotten a lot of buffs since the original release of Elden Ring. All the consecutive buffs that it has received makes it one of the most buffed weapons in the entire game. This has spiraled the weapon out of control. It went from being a pretty powerful weapon to contender for absolute strongest weapon in the entire game. One might ask what's up with the developers, why all the buffs, but it's obvious. The Dark Moon Greatsword is the reward of Elden Ring's longest quest chain, and it's also the most iconic weapon in the entire From Software franchise, so obviously it needs to be good. Very good. The Dark Moon Slayer is the owner of the iconic Dark Moon Greatsword and holds it with pride, because why wouldn't she? The sword is a piece of art, a visually stunning artifact that reflects true beauty in every shape and form. This legendary armament is every sorcery and weapon you can possibly wish for combined into a single weapon. Being a demigod herself and the daughter of two very powerful individuals, naturally the Dark Moon Slayer has a high standard to adhere to. While on the surface the Dark Moon Slayer might look like a friendly figure, do not be mistaken, you do not want to antagonize her. The Dark Moon Slayer has a dark background and runs various schemes at the same time. She's a master in the arts of manipulation, and with that has an easy time convincing many people into letting them do the dirty work for her. It is also known that the Dark Moon Slayer has in fact ties to the group known as the Black Knife Assassins, a group consisting out of dark figures that, as you may or may not know, carried out some of the most relentless and fearsome events in history, of which it is known that the Dark Moon Slayer herself was also involved with. The Dark Moon Slayer usually has better things to do than do all of the fighting herself, but if you are unfortunate enough to face her directly in combat however, well, let's say your odds of winning the fight are non-existent. Now, for gamers like us, we spend a lot of time in front of our screens, and that can lead to several problems with all that blue light that we're getting exposed to when doing so. Blue light is damaging to our eyes. Personally, I experience eye strain when looking at a screen for a long time, but headaches or even problems with sleeping are also common problems as well that occur from looking too much at screens. GMG Performance eyeglasses are the solution to blue light, and thanks to them for letting me test out their glasses and sponsoring today's video. These glasses act as a shield against all that blue light so your eyes don't get damaged, and they come in various models like the Optimizer model but also the Oronus model, and honestly all of them look very stylish, so when you're wearing a pair you're at least protecting your eyes in fashion, and that is important. I have tested them out quite extensively by now and can safely say that these glasses reduce the eye strain problem for me. Currently there is a bonus going on. You will get a 40% discount if you buy a pair of glasses, almost half the usual price, but you have to buy it within the next 48 hours of this video's release, so definitely go ahead and check out the link in the description to get a nice pair of GMG Performance eyeglasses yourself. Okay, let's start with a deep dive into the Dark Moon Slayer's iconic sword. The Dark Moon Greatsword makes quick work of anything really in Elden Ring, and I will be showing off the Dark Moon Slayer build against every single late game boss in the game in this video, and while doing so, I will present to you various arguments on why this sword might very well be the strongest weapon in the game. First of all, it is pretty much free damage and very FP efficient. How the sword works is that you cast the Ash of War Moonlight Greatsword, and in turn your Dark Moon Greatsword gets imbued with the light of the Dark Moon. Functionally speaking, this means that it buffs your sword, giving it an extra 65 magic damage, 15 extra frostbite buildup to the already innate frostbite buildup that the sword has, but most importantly it gives you a new, extremely destructive skill. Your charged attacks with the sword can now fire off these magical moonlight projectiles that deal a lot of damage if they hit your opponents. And since this is a ranged attack with a pretty good range, it has this benefit of you just destroying your enemies from a distance without having to worry about anything. But it gets better, because these moonlight blasts have amazing poise damage. So after shooting a few projectiles that you can chain very easily, by the way, it is quite spammable, it will in fact stance break whatever you're fighting, and every time you stance break anything in any fight, it pretty much means the end of that fight. Because whether you go for the critical hit or just shoot more of your moonlight, the damage output you have in a very short time span of where your enemy is stance broken and recovering from it is absolutely insane, and means your enemy's HP bar just completely depletes. Now, while shooting off these moonlight projectiles is a very safe way to get the damage in terms of maximizing your damage output, however, you kind of want to hit your opponents in melee range. Hitting them in melee range means not only do you hit them with the projectile itself, but you also hit them with the swing of the sword that shoots off the projectile, and that part in itself also deals damage. If you didn't know about this or are confused about it because you used the Dark Moon Greatsword like months ago, it was actually bugged back then, and it wouldn't detect that you would be hitting your opponents with the swing itself. So basically you would do 0 extra damage if you would hit them in melee range back then. But that got fixed, and it's now a great way to get extra damage in versus your enemies. But you have to weigh in the benefits of both aspects, obviously, whether you want to go for the ranged blast of moonlight or the melee blast of moonlight, as obviously it depends on the scenario that you're in. It is basically a question of, do you want the option that gives you the more safe, reliable damage but a little bit lower in terms of damage output, or do you want more damage but with more risk associated, obviously. And then with risk I mean things like getting interrupted yourself, which is something you're much more exposed to, obviously, when you're right next to your opponent. This is something that you will usually determine in the moment of the heat, and you will see for yourself which option makes the most sense to go for. Now, as you maybe already saw from the fight against Malekith, you would see that the blast of moonlight that comes from your sword has great tracking. It just shoots the beam exactly onto your locked target. Historically, however, this wasn't the case either, and this got fixed some patches ago. And it seems the tracking capability of the sword's moonlight was unintentionally skewed in the first few months post Elden Ring's launch, as they do in fact call it a bug, and that makes perfectly sense, honestly. This change was definitely needed and has made the sword just so much better and so much more practical. The tracking on the moonlight blast is really awesome now. So while the sword has amazing damage and amazing poise damage in both melee and ranged variations, you would think that that would be all, but it really isn't. Like I already mentioned before, the sword procs frostbite on your enemies, but the blast of moonlight does so as well. The moonlight builds up frostbite, and within a few casts, whether you are melee or ranged again, you'll proc it on your enemy. Now, the proc of the frostbite itself on your enemies is already a huge source of big damage, but then after that it also applies that debuff of frostbite where your enemies take 20% extra damage from that point onwards. And that is amazing synergy with the already hard-hitting Dark Moon Greatsword, as every subsequent hit or moonlight blast will now also start dealing more damage. The Dark Moon Greatsword works best in a pure intelligence setup. It has pretty much all of its scaling with intelligence, and I would definitely not bother putting any points in strength or dexterity in any capped setup, except to get the requirements, obviously, to wield the sword. Go all the way and get 80 intelligence, which also brings me to my next point, stats. Another plus to the Dark Moon Greatsword is that it really isn't stat dependent at all. You could finish the game with very low levels, even something like level 50 for sure with this build. Reasons being everything I mentioned before in this video, but also that the Dark Moon Greatsword is a unique weapon, so you can upgrade it with somber smithing stones, which are relatively easy to get, and you can therefore get it all the way to plus 10, its maximum upgrade, quite early on in your playthrough. The stats you then want to run for a level 125 build is 80 intelligence to maximize our damage output, and fully soft cap on intelligence, 16 strength and 11 dexterity to meet the requirements, and then 50 vigor for great survivability. You really don't need any mind with this build, as the Moonlight Greatsword Ash of War and the associated buff lasts for 60 seconds for only a bit of FP, and in 60 seconds any fight will usually already be over. A few more points in endurance is nice as well, just so you don't tire out as quickly. If you want to level even more and go to say level 150, then put 10 more points in vigor to fully soft cap on that and maximize your survivability, and then split the remaining 15 points in either endurance or mind or a mix, depending really on your personal needs. Like I just said, however, and I want to reiterate it, the build is definitely not stat hungry at all. Level 125 is more than you'll ever need. Now, the Dark Moon Greatsword is a weapon locked behind Ranni's quest chain, so you can't get it right at the start of the game, but you can make sure to make it a priority and start the quest chain relatively early on. If you want a build that transitions very well into this build, however, then there's definitely one build out there that does so perfectly, and it is my Spellblade Get OP early build. That build also uses a very unique combination of, on one hand, the Moon Veil, which also has that shooting off moonlight projectile element, so similar vibes to the Dark Moon Greatsword, but it also makes use of Carian sorceries, and most fittingly the Carian Grander Ash of War infused on an Uchi Katana, making it this unique samurai spellblade type of build that is really fun as well. Carian Grander also has a similar vibe to the Dark Moon's Greatsword's burst and grandiosity with the burst and size of that Ash of War, and then finally it is also an intelligence focused build that in that video I show you how to make right at the start of the game and be as OP as possible with it, making it a great option to use before you obtain the Dark Moon Greatsword for this build. Finally, before we get into more juicy boss fights, let's also talk about the Dark Moon Slayer setup. For talismans, the Dark Moon Greatsword has amazing synergy with a lot of stuff, which is another bonus. We're going to go as offensive as possible with this build, as we do have good vigor and a lot of stanza breaking capability. That means that the Magic Scorpion Charm is pretty much a staple with its 12% extra damage to everything in our kit. Then you want to run the Godfrey icon because it boosts our Moonlight Blasts, as you can in fact charge them, and also the Shard of Alexander, as that talisman will boost our Ash of War's damage output significantly as well. And finally, the Ritual Sword talisman to give us a nice damage boost when we are at full HP. Since we have great reach with the Dark Moon Greatsword, we can definitely in a lot of scenarios just be at full HP and really utilize the Ritual Sword talisman and do amazing damage. For our flask, we want to run the Magic Shrouding Crack tier, which is an absolute no-brainer. It boosts literally everything in our kit, from our Ash of War to the actual damage of the sword itself to any sorcery you would like to run additionally, and then the Cerulean Hidden tier because it allows us to cast anything for 15 seconds without costing any FP. For armor, if you want the maximum damage output that is possible, you would run the entire Spellblade set for 2% bonus damage per piece, so 8% extra damage in total. However, I don't want to have the same generic look every time I use a magical Ash of War just to ramp up my damage as much as possible. I don't know that, that's for the peasants. So I only use the gloves and boots and sacrifice 4% of our damage to use the Snow Witch head and Snow Witch robe, to make our character as much in line as possible with Ranni, and the robe and head are much more dominant to your look than the gloves and boots, so that is also nice. With the added benefit of actually our Snow Witch head boosting cold sorceries with 10% extra damage, including the noteworthy Ranni's Dark Moon, which brings me to my next point. Sorceries. Now, because we have 80 intelligence, we can also use any sorcery in the game with our staff in our offhand, even though it's really not needed. The Dark Moon Greatsword has everything you need. But to stick to the theme, there is one sorcery tied to the Dark Moon, and that is in fact Ranni's iconic sorcery, Ranni's Dark Moon. Now, Ranni's Dark Moon combos actually very well with the Dark Moon Greatsword. The reason being is that Ranni's Dark Moon has amazing range that goes well beyond the range of the Dark Moon's Greatsword Moonlight Blast. It can pretty much hit any boss that is all the way across the arena. So that basically means immediately while you start any boss fight, you can maximize your damage output by already starting to engage in combat with spamming Ranni's Dark Moon. And these nuclear bombs on themselves can already just destroy bosses completely from across the arena if that's something you're interested in. And with the just mentioned Cerulean Hidden tier, we can really spam this sorcery as well for 15 entire seconds, which is really nice since Ranni's Dark Moon costs a lot of FP to cast, but as in my setup you would only want to cast it at the start of the fight, really when there's a lot of distance between you and the enemy. Therefore it synergizes amazingly well with the Cerulean Hidden tier. With it we can cast and really spam this FP expensive sorcery for no cost at all and enjoy all of its benefits. However, if they manage to survive the spam by, say, drinking a potion like a pussy, or you just don't feel like spamming Ranni's Dark Moon too much and your opponent gets into closer range, then it perfectly sets up for killing your target with the Dark Moon Greatsword as well, as usually the Ranni's Dark Moon spam will already have taken massive chunks of your enemy's HP. Additionally, Ranni's Dark Moon has this great property that it absorbs any spell that is cast in its path, and thus it's amazing versus caster enemies as it nullifies anything your enemy tries to kill you with, especially when it just takes all of the room because you're spamming it for free like I just mentioned. And finally, and very important, is its unique debuff that lowers the magic negation of your target with 10% once it hits whatever you're fighting, as indicated with the blue effect surrounding your target. And then in addition it also procs Frostbite, which like already mentioned reduces the negation of your enemy even more and does in fact stack with the other debuff of Ranni's Dark Moon. You know what also stacks? You giving the video a like and to subscribe to me if you haven't yet, and also hit the bell so you're extra cool. And yes, you can in fact do all of those things at the same time. It is a miracle. I also have to mention Terra Magica. It is also a great option for a buff sorcery that increases your damage output even more, even though as you saw from my earlier footage you definitely don't need it. Which is another bonus for the Dark Moon Greatsword, you don't need any buffs to do insane damage with it. By the time you're finished casting Terra Magica, you can already have like taken at least half the HP of your enemy easily. And Terra Magica does confine you to stay in one spot, but it essentially is a free buff that we can use with all our levels in intelligence that spikes your damage output with the sword with 35% even more damage for 30 seconds as long as you stay in the circle. And you can see how fast you mow down enemies with a lot of HP with it when you stay in the circle, and versus enemies like Redican, you can just completely decimate him within seconds when you use this sorcery in addition. It's just a great sorcery that synergizes well with the major damage that already comes out from the Greatsword. Definitely not needed, but it's a nice bonus. And then finally, one more argument, the moveset of the Greatsword. The moveset of the Greatsword is also great, and the Dark Moon Greatsword is in fact a Greatsword. Surprise, surprise. You have this quick normal attack in your moveset that you can chain well with your charged attacks and the moonlight blasts to finish off things reliably or just to get great damage in quickly. The Dark Moon Slayer is also an amazing Malenia killer. It pretty much just destroys Malenia from start to finish like it's absolutely nothing. And with the amazing damage output, but also the amazing and fast stance breaking that you in fact can do, that yet again we have to reiterate, you have a build that just completely controls Malenia. And with that, it is another bonus, its capability to just trivialize the hardest bosses in the game without having to worry much about anything really. Now you have seen my Dark Moon Slayer build in action on every relevant late game boss in this video, while a variety of different arguments were presented supporting the notion that the Dark Moon Greatsword is the best weapon in the game. But there are always differing opinions, and there are a lot of other very powerful weapons obviously. Is the Dark Moon Greatsword the best weapon in the entire game? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. If you haven't tried it yet, enjoy making the Dark Moon Slayer and playing with this build. You will have an absolute blast. It's really fun and extremely powerful.